Welcome back to Church Matters, a podcast designed to help the church understand and apply a biblical worldview to all of life. Today we're joined by Dr. Andreas Köstenberger, who has been in ministry in seminary settings for many years. He's been a professor and a theologian. He's written many books, both by himself and in conjunction with his wife, Marnie. And we're excited to have him on the podcast today to talk about what it looks like to live Christ-honoring lives in different stages of our lives. So we'll be talking about what it looks like, what a biblical marriage is, what it looks like to walk through singleness with a biblical worldview, and to raise children one day. And so we'll hear from him on all those topics. And so I hope that you'll enjoy this conversation and this interview. And we'll throw over to Gabe and Dr. Köstenberger.
Hi, well, excited to have everybody listening to this episode of Church Matters. We are joined today by Dr. Köstenberger, Dr. Andreas Köstenberger. Am I saying your name correctly?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. I want to make sure that I don't mess that part up right off the bat. Dr. Köstenberger did his PhD work at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's currently a theologian resident at Fellowship Raleigh, and he's a co-founder of Biblical Foundations, which is biblicalfoundations.org. There's tons of resources and material there. He's the author of multiple books, and he and his wife, Marnie, have been married for 35 years, and I assume grandkids at this point. How many kids and grandkids do you have, Dr. Köstenberger?
Well, we have one granddaughter, and both of our daughters are pregnant.
Okay.
So we're looking forward to,
There's a Köstenberger boom right around the corner then, huh? Yeah. In the grandkid department, right? So, well, that's wonderful. And he's written on multiple subjects. But one of the reasons I wanted to have Dr. Köstenberger on the podcast was because I found myself referencing him and thinking sort of his thoughts after him a lot lately as I prepared for the sermon series that we're about to jump into on singleness and marriage and family and older age, and just reading his an excellent work that he did called God, Marriage, and Family. I have the first edition. I have the old copy, but he's done a second edition since then, and now I understand you're also working on a third edition. Is that right?
That's right.
And when is that supposed to come out? Do you have an idea?
In a couple of years.
Okay. And so he just has written extensively. That book is so good. It covers everything from the areas I mentioned, but I mean, it gets into very specific things like reproductive technologies, artificial reproductive technologies, and singleness and biblical arguments. And there's a whole biblical theology to it too, which really comes through. And so I would just highly commend that work to anybody listening. Very accessible also. And so that book and then is really a great book, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you. But the other reason is we're getting ready to do to study the book of John, the Gospel of John, for about two and a half years as a church. And so then as I was looking for good commentaries that I really wanted to utilize, or good books to utilize for my work in preparing a sermon, I again came across your name. So you're everywhere in my study lately. And so I thought better to just have you on and get to talk to you in person rather than interacting with you through a book. So
well, you and I have a lot in common. You and I have a lot in common. Those are, things I guess we're both interested in.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So this episode, we're going to really be talking a lot about marriage, family, singleness, because, man, if there's an issue that even Christians seem to be so often confused about, and certainly are getting counter-biblical messages continually, it's regarding the issue of marriage and family and singleness, just life in these various relationships. And so I would love to pick your brain and talk to you about a couple of things related to this. So again, thank you for being here, Dr. Köstenberger.
Happy to be with you.
Well, maybe let's start by just talking a little bit about marriage. And one of my, sort of the vision behind this series in part is to give people just a kind of an overarching picture of the beauty, the purpose, God's vision for each one of these categories. And so maybe if you would help us just understand, what is the purpose of marriage biblically? What is God getting at, if I could say it that way, in creating marriage?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And, both Marty and I grew up in non-Christian homes, and so we really couldn't go by our own experience. We had to search the scriptures, and of course, that is so important because there's all kinds of stereotypes of what traditional marriage is, and what some of the standard roles are, but there's nothing like like the subtitle of our book, Rebuilding the Biblical Foundation, to go back to scripture. And so, as you know, in the first chapter of Genesis, it says that God created humanity male and female, something that till very recently we pretty much could assume and take for granted in our culture. God created humanity male and female, and he told the man and the woman to be fruitful, to multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue it, and to exercise dominion over it. So, the way I might paraphrase that is that the married couple is normally to have children, the partner in managing the earth for God and for his glory as his divinely appointed human representatives. That's the background of being made in God's image.
Mm-hmm. And so when we consider marriage, one of the things, of course, we would say, yes, marriage is between a man and a woman, and there's this normative purpose to it in producing children. How would you connect that to the creation mandate and sort of that idea? I would assume that has to do with God's vision and purpose for marriage as well, as, right, go forth, multiply, fill the earth.
Yeah, of course, this is all pre-fall, and things are unfortunately not as simple anymore.
Yeah.
But God's original purpose simply was that, he took more than Adam and Eve to fill the earth. So part of their mandate was to have children so that they would fill the entire globe with his image bearers, and of course the idea that as his representatives, we would simply, do what we've done for centuries to cultivate the earth, to engage in various inventions and explorations and so forth. So that was God's vision from the beginning, prior to the fall.
And one of the things I love that you at least talked about in the first edition of the book, I assume it made it in the second and will in the third as well, but is marriage as covenant biblically and not contract. Now, I understand that biblically those words covenant and contract actually have quite a bit of overlap, it seems. But in our current culture today, when people think of marriage as a contract, that seems to be more the cultural way that we would speak about it. And we're still trying to hold on to this biblical picture of marriage as a covenant. But maybe for the average Christian, those two things are blurred, but not in the way that they're blurred biblically, but they're blurred in the sense that people have actually started to think of covenants in the same way they've thought of contracts, that it's something you could just kind of come in and out of. And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit. I know you also have the other category of sacrament, but I think in our context as a Protestant church, probably what more people get tripped up by is that covenant versus a contract kind of language regarding marriage. And I would love you to speak to that. I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. And you're right. I appreciate you mentioning that in the original ancient Near Eastern context, that covenants were basically just certain types of contracts.
Right,
so today we draw this fairly sharp distinction, as we'll talk about in a minute, but in the original they were not really that far apart. Essentially, a covenant was a contract, if you will, where God was one of the parties. In chapter 4 of God, Marriage, and Family, we compare and contrast those two different conceptions of marriage. The contractual view is the main secular view, as I mentioned, in our culture. It views marriage essentially as an agreement between two parties that they voluntarily enter and then continue in, and dissolve when certain conditions are no longer met. And already we can think of numerous marriages, right, that we've seen that fell apart because the foundation was really fairly weak. Like I mentioned, this idea of a contract, right, is conditional, like contracts typically are, on the continued performance of the contractual obligations by both parties. They are entered for one's own benefit, and typically they're temporary. And so when the conditions are no longer met, then that would give the other party the opportunity to end the contract. And as a result, we see that divorces are incredibly rampant. I just did some statistical research for the third edition, and I found out that I think last year about 700,000 marriages ended in divorce in the United States. That is just a staggering number, when you think about that. And then marriage as a covenant, on the other hand, is a sacred bond between a man and a woman that they enter publicly before God as a witness, and that is normally consummated by sexual intercourse. And of course, Genesis 2:24 says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh," which of course means much more than sexual intercourse. It means establishing a new family unit, in distinction from the families of origin.
Yes. Yeah. So when we think of marriage as a contract, I think many Christians today would not, either maybe they wouldn't think of the distinction between those two things because they're so kind of saturated in the cultural way of thinking that they wouldn't really think of a big difference between covenant and contract. Or when they think of a covenant, they just still end up kind of putting into it the meaning of a contract. So they'll use the language of covenant, but it's kind of the Princess Bride. You're using that word. I don't think you understand what it means, kind of thing. They're turning it into something other than what a covenant really is. So a distinctive aspect of a covenant is that it's not, if I understand you correctly, is that a covenant isn't just broken for any reason. A covenant isn't just, hey, you didn't meet XYZ aspects of the contract, but that a covenant is more binding than that a covenant has some more thickness to it than a typical contractual way of thinking. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. And that's because it's not simply an agreement between two, human beings, but it is entered into, as part of a sacred, set of promises before God as a witness.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, having said that, I think I usually do explain to people that the word covenant is not used for marriage a great deal, surprisingly, maybe in the Old Testament. A couple times, once I think in Malachi and once in the book of Proverbs, almost kind of in passing. And so you might expect more there. And I think maybe the reason is that there's a difference between marriage and some of the covenants that God made with his people, in which he is actually one of the two parties, such as, the covenant with Abraham or with David, or then the new covenant in Christ, and of course that covenant is sure to be fulfilled because it is conditioned only on God's character and his promises, and of course they will never fail. And I think that sometimes comes into play when people talk about divorce and remarriage, or in certain exceptional circumstances. And so there, I think it's helpful to understand that, yes, marriage is a covenant, but there's a distinction between the covenant of marriage and the Abrahamic, Davidic, and new covenant.
Gotcha. Yes. And so when we think of the covenant, you said the Bible doesn't have a ton of language directly associating marriage with covenant, but obviously many of us as Christians have that kind of. When I do marriages, I talk about this being a covenant, and so where do we get that idea then of marriage being a covenant? Is it really just those two verses? Is there a bigger biblical kind of theology related to this? Where do we get that idea of marriage being a covenant?
Yeah, I don't know historically how that developed, but I think it is partly just to emphasize the idea that it is uh, uh, number one, God created marriage, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So in the first place, this is something that we fulfill certain roles as husband and wife, right? In fulfilling the roles that God assigned us in the beginning, and people might look at that verse that I quoted, Genesis 2:24, as sort of
Yes, yeah.
The paradigm, the one flesh union, and I think people wanting to underscore the solemnity of the occasion, the promises made by the husband and the wife to each other, with God as a witness, that are not to be, forsaken lightly. It's maybe a little bit like we ask members to sign a church covenant or a membership
Yes,
covenant.
yeah, right. Yes.
Again, just to underscore, this is something that matters. It is entered into before God. We have every intention to keep the promises we make, that kind of thing.
So, one of the things I want to ask you about is when a husband and wife, this one flesh union kind of idea, in many covenants, maybe every covenant that I can think of biblically, there's always a covenantal head, right? So you mentioned the Davidic covenant or the Noahic covenant. And so there's kind of this idea that, okay, they are this representative of humanity in some way. The Adamic covenant, they're representative of humanity in some way, or and then it's in relation to God. And so in marriage, how should we think of that? Is we know this language of headship and submission biblically from places like Ephesians 5 and in 1 Peter, but this kind of idea of headship and submission. So is part of the headship of a husband related to covenant? Is that really not how we should think of those things? Are they not really related? How should we think of headship and submission and as it relates to covenant?
Yeah, so on a very broad level, we see that word Adam is used both for Adam, the first man, and for humanity as a race, the human race in the creation narrative. I think that is very significant because that already is maybe one of the strongest indication of what you might say, federal headship, or that Adam is representative of humanity at large. And then in the New Testament, very important biblical theological paradigm, you have Christ referred to as a second or last Adam in correspondence to the first Adam. And in Romans, I think chapter 4, I believe it is, and also in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about that correspondence, that Christ is the head of a new creation, or of the new humanity, if you will, the antitype of Adam. And so I think this is a paradigm that I've never seen evangelical feminists address, at all, much less satisfactorily. People who hold to radical unfettered equality, not just in dignity and worth before God, but also in role. So I think here you clearly see that Adam, as you go back to the beginning in the creation narrative, God made him first, something that Paul repeatedly stresses, and that's hard to deny, reading the creation narrative, and that the man was already given certain responsibilities and commands by God before the woman was even created. And then you see also at the fall that the man was held primarily responsible for not just his own sin, but even for Eve's sin. Even though Eve sinned first, God calls the man to account first, immediately after the fall. And so those are just a few I think, very
Yeah.
powerful indications, biblical indications, that God assigns the primary responsibility for the family, and then Paul extends that to God's household, the church in the New Testament, to the man as the leader.
Hmm.
And so you
Would
already
you say,
mentioned
yeah,
Ephesians 5,
right.
right? Where it says that wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head. There's that word, the Greek word kephale, is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of a church. And now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. So I think that is an extremely powerful passage that makes very clear that God has assigned to the man a unique role of leadership, and the woman is to submit to him as, what Genesis 2 calls his suitable helper.
Yeah, that language of head or headship, I've seen kind of a push in certain corners of evangelicalism, but then also even within complementarianism to some degree, to maybe repackage that a bit toward, and I know it's an older argument as well, but as meaning source rather than having to do with authority. But I think, one of my questions would be, are you, if somebody gets into that as source rather than having to do with headship and having to do with responsibility and that kind of a thing, are they, okay, sorry. When you think about marriage, I guess, and there's a covenant being made between a husband and a wife, and when we're saying it's also between them and God. And so then there's this question of, okay, so who is the sort of head on the marital side of covenant? Who's the covenant head in that covenant with God? In the way that Adam is the covenant head of humanity in relationship to God. He's the one taking responsibility for us. So then as goes Adam, so went human beings. And then Christ is the covenant head of the new covenant. And so this covenant with the Father, with God, then Christ is our representative, right? And so within marriage, is it right to say that the husband is the covenant head within marriage is in relation to God? Is that a correct way of speaking about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think the problem with egalitarian arguments are that the issue is a lot more extensive in Scripture. The issue of male headship than merely redefining terms like head or even helper. That's more really something that my wife has shown me that radical feminists or reformist feminists regularly do, to basically reinterpret key terms or key passages. But I think cumulatively, it still ends up to be a very weak case when, as you mentioned, you have those very strong indications of male headship. I'm just giving you, I quoted Ephesians 5, but really the first time that word head is mentioned in Ephesians is in Ephesians 1:22 and 23. And there it says, and he, meaning God, put all things under his feet, meaning under Jesus' feet. Clearly language that denotes authority, right? To put things under his feet, and gave him as head over all things to the church. And so clearly there, the word head, to go no further, right, than earlier in the same book, doesn't merely mean that Jesus is the source of humanity or that kind of thing, but it's the language of headship. And my former professor at Trinity, Wayne Grudem, looked at, I think, 5,000 instances of the word kephale or head in extra biblical Greek literature, and he determined that that idea of source is only used for rivers, where you have maybe the waters of a river. So that kind of makes sense, but it's never used for, people in like human relationship. But as far as I'm concerned, that's wonderful for us to give us the full scoop of that usage. But I'm happy to just go to Ephesians and to look at.
And that's when it came up when I preached through the book of Ephesians at our church about a couple of years ago or so. That's when it came up, is that there were people that were grabbing a couple of YouTube clips of some popular speakers and saying, hey, well, but what about this? And so I know it's it's out there, but I think if people will actually read some of the literature, and I didn't realize that Wayne Grudem had done that, it made that kind of a comparison. That's pretty striking. So, and I think your wife's book, actually, Jesus and the Feminists, Marnie Köstenberger is a theologian in her own right and brilliant, and often writes with you on many of your works. In the future, hopefully we can get her to do something for us too, maybe. But she's actually written on this subject. Even in that book, it comes up. And so I think it's helpful to hear that perspective as well. One kind of last question I want to ask you in this category, sort of as we think about marriage, is I know that you said early on in your description of marriage and God's plan for marriage that the marriage normatively would produce children. And one of the things that we're seeing right now, even among Christians, is that people are waiting longer and longer to get married, and they're waiting longer and longer to have children, which then, even if they decide once they get married finally, and then they decide to start having kids finally, that just by the nature of how much longer that's been delayed, you're going to have less kids. And so it's going to be this idea of the DINK, the dual income, no kids, is kind of rising in popularity. And so why should Christians, I know you're going to say that shouldn't be what we should embrace. So why shouldn't Christians embrace a picture that says, hey, just try to make as much money as you can, delay marriage as long as you can, delay having kids as long as you can, build your life up, get your house, get your career settled, do all of those things. And then if kids fit into it, go ahead and make that work. Why should Christians reject that kind of a picture?
Yeah, because God has a very significant purpose of marriage, as we already saw in Genesis 1. As creation as very essential and as central, not just as peripheral. And you're exactly right. I just, again, working on the third edition of God, Marriage, and Family, I looked at some statistics just this week, and now in the U.S., I believe the average age for men who do get married at is over 30 years.
Yes,
of age.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think for women, it's about 26, and that's a significant increase, over the last few decades. And so, yeah, you have people delaying marriage, getting either no children or less children, and of course, the fall has complicated matters. So clearly, being one flesh, being called to be fruitful and multiply would mean that having children would be just a natural outflow of being married. Unless, of course, some of the deplorable, either you have infertility is one of the effects of the fall, abortion, or maybe a little more complicated matter is that of contraception.
Yeah. So how should, I've got 4 kids. My wife and I have been married for 17 years, and we have 4 kiddos, 2 boys and 2 girls. And
do you?
Yeah. So we, so that life well then. Yeah. So it's a blessing. I got a little bit of both there. So it was nice to experience the differences but so my oldest is 13 and my youngest is 5. And one of the things that we run into a lot at our church, we have a lot of young families, a lot of people that are starting to have these questions of, okay, is 2 kids enough? Is 3 kids enough? Are we supposed to just keep going? Is birth control permitted? And so people even rightly feeling this pull toward, okay, kids are a normative part of family. Yeah. And how do you help people when people ask me the question, well, is it permissible for me to have a medical procedure or for us to use some kind of birth control? Or when have we been obedient essentially to the command to produce children? And how do you help people think through that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Certainly on the pastoral level, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm primarily, other than being a father and a husband, So I have an interest in the subject from that angle, but professionally, I'm a biblical scholar, and so
Yes.
I'm a New Testament scholar, an exegete, and biblical theologian, and so this is in part a debated issue because it's not maybe explicitly, or at least not extensively, addressed in Scripture. So we really have to operate on the basis of larger, biblical principles. Having said that, I believe there's nothing in Scripture that says that even though procreation is central in marriage, that every act of sexual intercourse must at least potentially be able to result in contraception, as say Roman Catholics do. So I do believe that contraception is permissible if we define it, and here comes the key point, as preventing conception.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that many contraceptive devices used today, as we talk about in the book, act after conception has already occurred, and this amounts to abortion. And of course, that's wrong. Yes. So if you're listening and you're contemplating various methods of contraception, and certainly we have more in the book, and I'm sure you and your staff can give advice there as well. Please make sure that the method you're using is preventing conception before it takes place, rather than killing the life that's already been created by having sex in the first place.
Yeah. Is in your third edition, is that an area, because that technology around, artificial, both artificial reproductive technologies, but also birth controls and various methods and the chemicals. And I'll just say from personal experience, my wife and I, when we were talking with a doctor at one point about birth control and earlier on in our marriage, they recommended something. And then we said, well, we're pro-life. And so we really want to make sure that this wouldn't end life after conception. And they said, oh, no, that's not the way this works. And we said, okay. And then a little later, we did some more research on it and actually found that it is the case, not in every instance, but that many instances that the chemical, the pill that they had recommended for birth control would have ended a life after conception. And so sometimes I even think doctors, they're not thinking through a pro-life lens all the time, right? And so they're not always thinking about this theologically. Sometimes they're just thinking about this as, well, it didn't get to a certain point of development, therefore you didn't end the life. And so in your third edition, are you hoping to be able to kind of examine or update some of the literature related to that?
It's a great question, because big part of it is to the biblical teaching has not changed. So that's the good news. So about 85% in the book will pretty much stay the same.
Yes.
It's the 15%, where the culture has significantly changed. And so we had to make some strategic decisions. And one of the decisions that we made is, to no longer try to attempt to exhaustively cover it, because it changes so much and has changed so much. So we rather, in a footnote, give people some relevant resources, and then in addition, a lot of it just will continue to change, and so they just have to search the net and talk to their pastor, and so we have a short section. We didn't just want to have nothing, but it is just kind of like I answered.
It's hard to keep up on all of that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, and so one of the ways that I've tried to answer that when people have asked me this question, because I agree with you that biblically, we do see this push toward, or the beauty of children and the importance of children, and we see that how children are valued in Scripture, but the Bible doesn't say, okay, after 3, it's time to stop, or after 7, or anything like that. And so where I've kind of landed on that pastorally is we have a responsibility as parents to steward this blessing that God has given us well of children, to disciple them, to train them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, to steward them well. And so if we, either for health reasons or just our own capacity, or are at a point where we're not able to do that well, then that might be a pretty good indicator that it may be time for us to not continue having children. I don't think the goal is just have as many children as you possibly can, and they may or may not have time to disciple them because there's so many. I think that the goal is to raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And so likely that means you're going to, normatively Christians should probably have more kids than they would think that they should. And maybe something less than the Roman Catholic picture of no birth control and just continue producing children as often as you can.
I couldn't agree more. That's certainly been my wife and my approach as well, both in terms of having more than you thought you might want to at first. I only have one sister. I always felt having two children, hey, that's a good number. But so we started out, with my wife wanting four children and me two, and so we ended up with four, right? So double as many as I started out with. And at the same time, when we had three children, in fairly rapid succession, about a year and a half apart each, I felt, just out of consideration from my wife, I felt we wanted to just wait a little bit for her to be able to handle, three little ones. And then we had the fourth one, several years later. So I totally agree. We have a certain amount of freedom. It's a stewardship, and we don't need to be, feel maybe overly compelled just by the general mandate to be fruitful and multiply.
Well, yeah, when you think of kids as being part of God's means of sanctifying us, which I think they certainly are, that there's sometimes only a certain amount of sanctification you can handle all at once. That 2 kids and 3 kids and 4 kids are going to teach you a lot of patience, and they're going to grow you in an understanding of God's heart and grace and all of that. But sometimes as you go to 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, now different people, sometimes they can absolutely, they have the resources, the ability, the maturity, et cetera, to do that. But I think for others, they might actually be getting into a place where it's no longer sanctifying, it's actually just kind of chaos. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom that needs to be there. Is it okay if we pivot to talk a little bit, and then we're kind of talking about it, but pivot to talking about family a little bit more now? I would love to just ask that question of what constitutes a family biblically. How should we think about that?
Sure. Well, as you know, there are many definitions of family used today. So I think it's a great idea to start there. I would define family essentially as primarily one man and one woman united in marriage. Of course, except for, if one of the partners passes away and then the other is widowed, and then normally you would have natural and or adopted children as part of the family. And so that would be the more narrow definition, which is more the definition in Western culture today. People call it the nuclear family. But then secondarily, as you know, in the ancient world, typically there were extended families, extended households, made up of father, mother, and children, but also others. And that's why, interestingly enough, the house tables, right, the household tables we have in the New Testament don't just include, the parents and the couple, but also include widows. They include, household servants and so forth. So more broadly speaking, then you could also think of a marriage as any other persons that are related, by blood to the nuclear family.
Mm-hmm. And so when we, probably the way that I can get myself most in trouble in our area, being in the Pacific Northwest over by, near Seattle, is when I tell people that as much as you might love your dog or your cat, that's not, when we think of the family biblically, it's normatively not you, your wife, and your cat.
Careful now, we do have a dog.
Yeah, we do too, and we love our dog. We named her, she was born on October 31st, Reformation Day, and so we named her Sola. So, I'm a good Reformed Protestant guy, so we love our pets around here. But when we think about that vision for family biblically, what should we think is of the purpose and the vision of the family? What is God getting at with family?
Yeah, so in addition to what you and I already talked about marriage itself, if God blesses a couple with children, then there's the added purpose. And I think you alluded to that verse, Ephesians 6:4, to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And interestingly, the word discipline, as you know, paideia, is actually broader than just, spanking or punishment. It has the idea of instruction primarily. So we will definitely want to be committed, right, as parents to shepherd our children's hearts. It's not just a matter of external commands. And ultimately, as all of God's creation, the family is to be, as Paul says repeatedly in Ephesians, to the praise of God's glory, to the praise of his glory. So, just as a capstone statement here, marriage and family are God's wise, God, and beautiful design. And that's the way my wife and I love to talk to people about marriage and family. Marriage and family are wonderful. They're extremely beneficial for us as his people, and they point to God's wisdom and goodness, and they bring him great glory and praise.
Amen. I would love to ask you, and it's okay if we don't get to talk about this very much, but I would kick myself if I didn't at least ask you about this. So in Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And you mentioned that word paideia. So right now we do sort of a homeschool hybrid situation with our kids in terms of Christian education. Our church is starting a classical school. We're going to be hosting a classical school here, really to try to help equip parents in part in doing Ephesians 6:4. But how do you, this I know could take us down a big rabbit trail, and I didn't even put this on your radar that we might talk about this, so it's okay if we need to pivot away. But how do you think a verse like that, or when we think about family, what responsibility do Christian parents have in regards to the education of their kids?
Love that question. We homeschooled our 4 children. They all got into decent colleges, have good, jobs, careers now. So it's a serious responsibility. I think that we acknowledge not everyone maybe has the background or the means to homeschool, but I think, biblically speaking, Deuteronomy 6 would probably be the place I would start. And the passage well, right? It's to teach our children on the way, and to basically, instruct them about God, about what God has done for us, to live out our faith before them. And so when you get to the New Testament and, Ephesians 6, I think that's still the idea there that as parents, we need to accept and assume primary responsibility for the education of our children, and even if we send them to Christian school or to public school, I think we certainly would not want to just subcontract out their education, so we can continue in our careers and just entrust our children's education to teachers or coaches or even pastors, for that matter.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the places it's been convicting for me, honestly, is even though we homeschool, I think really the bulk of the responsibility for the schooling of our children has been on my wife. And one of the things as I preached through that book that I kind of wrestled with was Paul saying, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. And then he goes right into, so I think he's still talking primarily to fathers here, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so to the degree that I understand this discipline and instruction of the Lord being about giving your children Christian education, then there's a way in which fathers have this primary responsibility for that. It doesn't necessarily mean I need to, now be at home full-time homeschooling my kids instead of my wife, but it means there is a real responsibility. This is not just my wife's job to do the schooling and I kind of do, sit at a distance.
Yeah, that's an added point there that you're making. I think that is very well taken. That I think you and I both know a lot of situations where really the truth is that the fathers are really not very involved, if at all, even if they're homeschooling, and so certainly that's a bit of a wake-up call to fathers to at a minimum support their wives and to be as involved as they can be. And in my context, my wife too did the lion's share of it. I did the extracurricular activities, sports, music, languages. I'm a German native speaker. I know some Latin, that kind of thing, but she did the main subjects. But as much as possible, I would at least try to ask her how the children are
Yeah,
doing.
yeah.
And certainly when they got older, right, high school age, I mean, it gets even a little bit more serious because the subjects are harder to teach and you need to enlist some outside help.
Right. I think my desire has been to help the families of our church, and particularly the fathers, understand that Ephesians 6:4 isn't just talking about bring your kids to church. Right. Yes, that's part of it. Fathers, give your kids a Christian education by bringing them to church and sit under the preaching of somebody like me. That's part of it, but it actually goes well beyond that. So, what do you think it looks like? This is perhaps a bit of a hot topic in our culture today, but it's one that I've been thinking a lot about. What do you think it actually looks like to cultivate masculinity and femininity in our children? You have this section in God, Marriage, and Family on masculine and feminine virtues. I ask about this because, one, there's a big push, again, even in kind of the complementarian world, to say, actually, we really shouldn't think in terms of masculine virtues and feminine virtues. We really should just think in terms of Christian virtue, being a disciple of Jesus, and therefore there's the fruit of the Spirit. That's really what we ought to be aimed at, is the fruit of the Spirit. We ought not really think in terms of masculine virtue and feminine virtue. And certainly I think there's a lot of truth to that. I do think that we should cultivate, of course, the fruit of the Spirit. But I think, to me, it sounds like we've gone a bit astray if we don't recognize that there are such things as masculine virtues and feminine virtues. And in a culture that is so much trying to obliterate any distinction, it makes it hard for parents to, I think there's parents that are scared to, if their son picks up a doll, to say, oh, no, son, we're not going to play Barbies, for fear of, somehow they've done some great psychological damage to them. Or, whatever, if their son says that they like the color blue, they get scared because, oh no, that sounds masculine in some way. And we need to make sure that they know that all colors can be masculine. And so a lot of people are really confused about how to talk about masculine virtue and feminine virtue, and what is that even? How have you talked about that, and how do you think through that?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said there, so I can just build on it and add a little bit more, as you know, that's a subject that has really catapulted itself into the forefront, even just, just to sometimes, extreme measures in the last maybe 10, 15 years. Remember raising some of that issues with my publisher, for the second edition. And then my wife and I worked on God's Design for Man and Woman, which is a biblical theology of manhood and womanhood. I think came out in 2016. And so I think back then the publisher still told us that was just on the verge of the transgender revolution, that maybe that's a little bit too extreme, and it might turn off certain people if we talk too much about some of those issues. But clearly, that's not true anymore. So I think from the way I see it, and people often caution against, not getting too hung up on those external superficial stereotypes, but to tap more into the deeper reality of what does it mean for us to have been created, by our Creator as a man or a woman, and it's almost like we're coming full circle the way we started our conversation. Right. Where God made the man as a leader, as we've seen, and so boys should be taught to accept the responsibility to lead. Thinking of my two boys, right? To teach them to accept responsibility when they go out on a date or when they, are in a relationship, to lead, to take the initiative in the relationship, to provide, to protect. I think those are true masculine virtues and qualities that we ought to instill in our boys, and for girls and for women. I think God made them to be compatible with the man, to be nurturing and caring, especially toward, if they're married, toward their husband and children, but not limited to girls who are married. You should be willing to submit to their husband's leadership, partner with him, intelligently, creatively, So I think those are the types of qualities we should strive to cultivate in our boys and girls. Leadership qualities in boys, and nurturing and caring qualities in girls. And as you mentioned, alongside with some of the generic qualities of discipleship,
Right.
integrity, purity, and so forth.
Yeah, where I get the biggest pushback on that, because I completely agree, where I get the biggest pushback, and maybe you've heard this as well, is also I shouldn't want my sons to be nurturing. I shouldn't want my daughters to take responsibility, and so that's the constant kind of pressure that, and so yeah. I guess first of all, just how do you respond to something like that? I'm curious.
Well, I think my wife and I always come back to the underlying purpose, in the creation narrative, because that's not tainted by the fall. It is interesting, though, that in Genesis 3, and that's a passage I sometimes go to in that situation, when God pronounces the punishment, if you will, for the fall, and he talks to the husband and the wife. He does talk about their primary areas of responsibility. And so for the husband, he says, by the sweat of your brow, you will earn your keep, you will cultivate the garden, right? And so that corresponds to husbands working, right, in the public arena, in the larger world. He even tells Adam, because you listen to the voice of your wife, right? In other words, you failed to exercise proper leadership. Remember, Adam was nowhere to be found when the devil led Eve into sin. So, among other things, you have a breakdown of communication and the failure of leadership. And to the woman, God says that she will experience pain in childbearing, and she will there will be this struggle for control between her and her husband. Your desire will be to rule over him. And so, again, that indirectly, right, kind of seems to affirm that the woman's primary God-given role is that of wife and mother.
Yeah, it's interesting because, sometimes what'll happen with something like, let's say, a doll, is people will think, oh, okay, women became more nurturing and caring because people marketed to them dolls. And I always argue, no, it's the exact opposite. The capitalists, right? They tapped into, girls have this nurturing, caring disposition. They want to nurture, and so let's market to them something, and to their parents something that we can sell them to tap into that natural instinct. And just like for boys, I don't think it's that, boys were just walking around and they had no aggressive instinct in them whatsoever. And then along came Mattel, and they made a bunch of, toy guns and Nerf and swords and everything. And all of a sudden the boys went, what is this? We have no desire. And they said, no, be aggressive. I think rather what it is that there's this natural instinct toward protectiveness, which has to then come with it a certain kind of dangerous aggression that needs to actually be honed and developed and discipled and properly aimed. And so then when these toys or different things come along, they sort of fit how God has already naturally made men and women. And I think the same is true when you look at sports, and you look at, if you get a group of boys together that are, 7 to 12, and they're hanging out, it's not going to be long before they've made up some kind of game that they're hitting each other, throwing something, doing something dangerous. You're going to be really having to make sure that they're okay. That's different than a group of typically girls in that same age group and the kinds of games that they're going to come up with. And so how much of that's nature, how much of that's nurture? I think biblically we'd have to say a good amount of that is nature. Agree with that?
Yeah. So I think worldview is very important here. And I think people need to understand that some people who dispute the biblical worldview in that regard, that there's distinct, differences between men and women and in the nature of their role, really operate within a materialistic, worldview, often, presupposing evolution. I just now reading a book, Atomic Habits, which is a bestseller, and I'm learning a lot about, how to lead a maybe a more, disciplined life. But the author continually presupposes, evolution. And Carl Trueman, of course, wrote a brilliant book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self.
Yes.
And he says the same thing, that, you look at some of the leading thinkers in Western civilization in the last few centuries, and it's people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche, who were all atheists and, believed, Charles Darwin, right, believed in evolution, and they've really shaped our Western collective, consciousness. And so Carl Trueman makes that point. You really need to look at the worldview. And often you're talking to somebody, and really, if the truth were known, their worldview and the Christian worldview have almost nothing in common. It's like
That's
oil
right.
and water, not mixing at all.
That's good. Yeah. It's a conversation that I'm so glad, first of all, that you're one of the voices that's speaking into it, because you're so thoroughly biblical in how you approach it. But it is a conversation that for pastors and at the church, the average person in the pew, they're just regularly bombarded with questions and various intricacies of questions that take a lot of wisdom. It's not sort of, okay, just turn to this verse and this chapter, and here's the one verse solution to it all. It's thinking with a biblical worldview, which is really why we even do this podcast. Our tagline is that we want to help equip Christians to think with a biblical worldview about all of life, because that's what we're called to do, right? We're not just called to think biblically about one very narrow area of life, or just make sure that we have our doctrine of the Trinity right, as important as of course that is. But we have to learn to think biblically about all of life, and certainly that includes marriage and family and the things that we're talking about. So thank you. One of the last kind of areas I wanted to be able to talk about is singleness. And singleness, that's actually the sermon I'm going to be preaching this Sunday is related to singleness, and out of 1 Corinthians 7. And so I think one error in the church seems to be to demote singles to really second-class citizens, and they're sort of an afterthought. They haven't yet fully arrived as mature believers. One day they'll get there to some of these great things we're talking about in marriage and family. But in the meantime, they're sort of a second-class citizen, and they're not invited to people's houses. They're not invited into relationship, and they can just live a really lonely life sometimes, and kind of think that part of the goal of the Christian life is faith in Christ, and then also I need to make sure I get married if I really want to be a mature believer. And so that's sort of one ditch, I think. The other ditch that I'm becoming increasingly aware of, that does really seem to be growing in scope, is this idea that singleness is better, actually, in some ways. And I'm even seeing this in evangelicalism, that perhaps being single is actually the preferred state. But unfortunately, many of us, we burn with passion. And so therefore we have to kind of give in to something like marriage and family. And that really that's the second rate thing, that really the holier people would be the single people. And then there's some cultural connections with that, because there's a big movement right now. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but on Twitter, it's a big idea of the manosphere, and it's kind of this way of talking about men. It's not Christian at all. And a big kind of push in that world is, men, you shouldn't get married. You open yourself up to divorce and having your resources taken from you, and you shouldn't get married. Have as many partners as you can, really just live a sort of hedonistic lifestyle, and this is the best way to protect yourself in a world that is against you. And so for some Christians that are being taught that singleness is actually better, and then they hear this echo, particularly for men, that really it isn't all that wise to get married. The divorce rates are high. She could take everything from you, your children from you. You'd be better off being single. I'm seeing some Christian men actually be quite enticed by that. And so, I just would love for you to speak to a little bit just how singleness is viewed biblically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I didn't get married till I was a little over 30, so I guess I fit the statistic, but I didn't become a Christian until the end of my college. I was 23, and so I had a little bit of growing up to do spiritually first. But for me, this is not just theory. I still very well remember what it was like, and I think you're exactly right. There's a lot of ambivalence in our churches toward singles, and so it's, as always, right. It's good to go back to what the Bible says. Now, one of the ironies in the New Testament is that the person who wrote the most eloquent passage on marriage, right, the Apostle Paul,
Yeah.
Ephesians 5, he's also the one who wrote the most, glowing passage about singleness. So the question is, how can it be both, right? How can marriage be so wonderful and then singleness, also be something that's, highly exalted? And so I think part of it would be explained by the fact that 1 Corinthians 7, your sermon passage for this week.
Help me out with my prep here.
Yeah, right. Is addressing a bit of a unique situation. He talks about, the current distress and also the opening verse. Our listeners, they will probably in their Bibles now, the more recent translations have it actually in quotation marks. Now concerning the things you wrote, it is not good for a man to, touch a woman as a euphemism for, having sex. So this is the first question that actually the Corinthians were asking Paul and that he's responding to, meaning they were asking, so is it actually good for us, for the sake of a higher spirituality, most likely, to refrain from marriage, even to refrain from sex? And we see that in the first few centuries of a church. That was, in fact, what many church fathers believed, that remaining single somehow, was spiritually superior. And of course, Roman Catholic celibacy. I grew up Roman Catholic. I wrote on this topic, on my website. I have some material on that. Really grew out of this, I think, mistaken notion that somehow men who wanted to be leaders in the church had to remain ritually pure so they could serve at the altar, if you will, something that was true for Old Testament priests. But, that in the New Testament, one of the qualifications for elder or overseer is that of being a faithful husband. So Paul actually assumed that church leaders who are typically married, and same with deacons. So in the chapter on singleness in God, Marriage, and Family, chapter 9, we have an entire chapter on that. That was probably the most surprising and fascinating of all of them for me, because in terms of biblical theology, you see an incredible amount of movement. The trajectory goes from singleness being extremely rare and unwelcome in the Old Testament to actually being commended as a gift from God, at least, for those who have it, and so in the Old Testament, we talk in the chapter about the fact that singleness was limited either to people who were too young to get married, widows, right, who lost their husband, or people with unusual either birth defects or economic or other hardships, whether leprosy or abject
Eunuchs,
poverty, eunuchs, that kind of thing. So there's one person, I think Jeremiah, whom God told not to marry, but again, because of the times in which he lived and the exile. But then you turn to the New Testament, and both Jesus and Paul speak of singleness as a God-given state, as a gift. Jesus in Matthew 19 refers to eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And in 1 Corinthians 7:7, Paul says, I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So it's one of those charisma, right? The spiritual gifts that God gives to at least a few. And Paul himself puts himself in that category as somebody who, at least when he wrote 1 Corinthians, he was not married.
One of the things I want to kind of dig into a little bit here, because actually one of the main motivations for me doing this series on singleness and marriage and family and older age is, there's a few, but one of them was because as I began studying this issue of singleness over the last year or so, because I just wanted to think biblically about it better than I think I have. I became a little bit distressed by some of the different ways I was hearing it talked about in, again, from authors, from people that I really respect and like, but I just I don't think it made, at least to me, it didn't make sense of what I was seeing, not just in 1 Corinthians 7, but really the larger picture biblically. And so I've just been trying to think about it better than I have, and hopefully that helps the people of our church think about it more biblically. So critique me here on this, okay? I'll give you kind of what my thought process is on this, and you tell me if I'm missing something or if you would agree with this. But it seems to me biblically the normative pattern, sort of the accent, the push, the exhortation that Christians should feel is to get married and produce children. That is meant to be normatively what Christians are compelled toward. Would you agree with that?
I would. Yeah,
Okay.
like you said, not everyone does, but definitely you go back to the original purpose that we talked about, and I think even the fall just complicated matters, but it
Yes.
didn't do away with God's original purpose.
That's right. Okay. And so I think the idea that every Christian person sort of just stands at a crossroads, and on one hand is marriage and on the other hand is singleness, and really choose whichever one you want and what fits best for you. And and you just kind of go, and I don't think that's what we should feel. I think that by and large we should feel a compulsion toward a biblical compulsion toward marriage and toward producing children. Now, that isn't to then say, or to denigrate in some way, or to devalue singleness. And as I try to make sense of the biblical data, it seems like there's maybe three categories of singleness. And I'm curious what you think about this. One category would be sin, that there are people who are single because actually they're sinful, meaning they're choosing to pursue comfort and maybe laziness and their own pleasures, and they actually very much enjoy not feeling the weight of responsibility, and they really just want to kind of live a life to themselves. And maybe they're just trying to make the most of their career, and that's really all they care about, or they want to travel and see the world, and they don't really want to get bogged down with responsibility. That seems to be one category of singleness, would be those who are going against the biblical exhortation, and very purposefully so, in order to pursue some kind of sinful desire instead of the ones that God would have us pursue. Do you agree that seems to exist as a category?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Okay. And then the second one would be, I think, perhaps affliction, which means I think of folks who, there's folks in our church and people that I've counseled over the years that they desperately want to be married, but for some reason or other, they are not able to be. Somebody has they've tried the dating thing, and nothing seems to happen, or there just seem to be no godly men around, or they're struggling, and they feel this sense of affliction. So they're having to learn contentment in all circumstances. They're having to learn what it looks like to be single and still be godly, to trust God's timing. But they're sitting with a kind of desire for children and desire for marriage. And yet that hasn't yet been fulfilled. And so I think of that category of singleness as sort of affliction. Do you see that category biblically, or maybe even in your experience in church and as a pastor theologian?
Yeah, I agree as well. People who would very much like to get married, but for whatever reason, find it difficult to find a compatible partner, often because of demographics.
Right.
I know my son, who would like to be married, I think, is living in an area in southern Florida where there's a lot of retirees and families and
Right.
demographics telling him are not necessarily in his favor. And so you have to recognize that and maybe seek the Lord, what
Hmm.
he would have you do about that. And that, of course, raises some questions in terms of, what does one do if
Right.
demographics are stacked against you?
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the status where when it's affliction, I think you need a lot of pastoral counsel and wisdom from people around you, and to say, okay, is there anything I'm doing that's contributing to this? Is there demographics around me? I've talked to people where they kind of felt like after college that was their chance to get married, meet somebody their age, and now they're like, I don't even know where I would meet someone. I don't want to do the online dating thing. My workplace, I work from home, and so those kinds of things. And so, okay, let's talk through some of those things. If you're truly experiencing this as an affliction, it certainly doesn't sound like it's a gift. It sounds like more of an affliction. Is there anything that we can do to help alleviate this kind of suffering that you're experiencing, while at the same time cultivating godly contentment? And then the third category is gift, which is what Paul seems to be, at least in part, talking about here in 1 Corinthians 7, of this idea that there's a kind of singleness that a person perhaps doesn't experience as an affliction, but rather that they are gifted in some way by God to do this, to be single. How should we think about singleness as a gift?
Mhm.
How common is it? Is it a gift that comes and goes? I hope that people would recognize that not every person who's single is necessarily enjoying the gift of singleness. They might actually be experiencing affliction, actually. And so just what is the gift of singleness?
Yeah, so I think in the literature I found, in some research,
Yeah.
looking at how other people talk about this issue, people actually use the word celibacy
Mm.
or the gift of singleness.
Mm-hmm,
And then
mm-hmm.
singleness is a broader category, which is, not if people don't have a gift, they would like to be married, or they're married not married because a choice they've made. And so, even though I struggle with that because celibacy, of course, in the Roman Catholic environment
Right.
means something different. It means the requirement for priests to not be married. But just anybody listening, right? That is, I think, standard nomenclature. Now, having said that, how does one know if one has that gift of singleness? Well, you've heard it said, right? If you're afraid you have a gift, then you probably don't, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think
Mm.
my experience is that people who do have a gift usually are not afraid of having it. To the contrary, there's often a lessened desire for sex and and the greater desire to certainly in the Christian environment to pursue serving the Lord, maybe in frontline missions or in some other way that would make it difficult to care for a family. Again, I'm not building my theology on my own personal experience, but just confirming what I've seen in Scripture. I'm thinking of my college roommate, Andy Smith,
Mm.
who's never been married and has served the Lord as a missionary to the Philippines
Mm.
for almost 30 years, and then
Mm. Mm.
I recently saw him. He's perfectly content
Mm.
not
Yes.
to be married, and he's
Right.
leveraged his singleness in just to be extremely effective, as a missionary. He would
Mm-hmm.
play, pick up basketball in Manila, and there's
Yes.
a
Yeah.
lot of guys who
Huh.
just love playing basketball with this
Right.
American,
Huh.
guys. So I've just marveled at, how somebody like him can really love being single, and clearly he has the gift, and he would tell you
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes what I've told guys is, hey, look, if you're wondering if you have the gift, sometimes of singleness, I'll ask them, are you looking at porn? And they kind of are taken aback in a little bit. And they're, what do you mean? Well, are you looking at pornography? And maybe yeah, sometimes. Okay, well, a lot of times what that's bound up with is sexual desire. And so if there's this sexual desire that is actually there and you're sinfully outletting it, what that probably means, because Paul talks about if you're burning with passion, right? And he's getting at this idea of sexual desire. If you're having those kinds of desires, that's a pretty good indication that you don't have the gift of singleness. Do you think there are other indicators for people as to whether or not they are, if we work with, I don't know how comfortable you are using those kinds of distinctions there of sin and affliction and gift, but if we work with sort of those category distinctions, are there indicators that somebody is has the gift of singleness in that? How could someone know if they're gifted with singleness or they just happen to find themselves single?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, and as Scripture, as Paul mentions, it is better to marry than to burn with passion. I think that's probably the clearest indication we have in Scripture. People have strong desire to have sex, to be married. Obviously, that ought to be exercised within biblical parameters of marriage, together with what we already established as the norm, that God expects, all things being equal, people to get married. And so I think honestly tell people that my understanding from Scripture is that unless a person feels gifted by God to not marry, to stay single, they can safely assume that God has called them to marriage. And so then it'd be a matter of pursuing a compatible spouse in the meantime, to serve God in the church, and to grow as a Christian. I believe God is sovereign, believing in divine providence, that you have to balance that with you doing your part, of course, and there's sometimes a hard balance. How aggressive ought you to be in pursuing marriage? I do think it's good to wait on the Lord, but that doesn't mean that we ought to just kind of, sit idly by and do nothing. So again, we could talk more about dating if we have time, but that's another area that Scripture is only giving us general principles on, that calls for, a lot of pastoral wisdom.
Yeah, it's I think two things that I wrestle with in that area. One is, I love what you said, because I totally agree about if someone is going, man, I hope I don't have to stay single. I don't think God goes, no, sorry, this is your gift, now take it. I don't think that's the way that it works. Can I take it back? Might be the question that, did you bring a gift receipt with that, Lord? And so I don't think that the way that we should think of the gift of singleness is somebody waking up, kind of looking over their shoulder saying, I really hope it's not mine. I don't think that's the way that works. I think that there is a gifting, and that it goes with, in some sense, desire. Sometimes people will ask me, how did you know that you wanted to be a preacher? And I would say, well, there was both desire and then gifting that God, I don't really buy the idea of somebody saying, I don't want to be a preacher, I want to have nothing to do with preaching, but God just thrust this gift on me, and so I have to. I think there's something in which God actually gifts us also in accordance with good godly desires. I think there's something of those things going together, and I think singleness maybe has similar overlap with that. But the other thing, when I think of this issue is, Paul seems to be talking about singleness. I'm trying to remember the exact language. Is it because of this present distress, or what's the exact language there? Do you remember off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it is exactly that. This present distress. Yeah.
Right. And so with that language, I know sometimes people have interpreted that as the present distress that Paul is talking about is just life as an exile, life this side of heaven. And so basically this always applies to just, it's always better for you to be single. I know others that have connected it maybe to a famine or something that was going on in Corinth at the time. They sort of see maybe an argument for there being some kind of serious event that was happening. Others, I'm a little bit inclined just toward the partial preterist kind of position. And so I tend to say, okay, well, maybe some of that distress that Paul was talking about there was actually this anticipated kind of cataclysmic AD 70 destructive, kind of maybe what Jesus was talking about in the Olivet Discourse. So what's your take? What's your take on the present distress that Paul was talking about there? Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I don't think anybody knows with certainty what he was referring to.
Yeah.
I do think it is probably more of a temporary, circumstance that he's.
So not just referring to life as a Christian generally as an exile, right? Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. Having said that, I think he does kind of relativize marriage. He says even for people who are married, right, they ought to live in a way as if they were not married. In other words, to understand that there will be no marriage in heaven. And so in some ways, we all ought to live as if we were single when it comes to pursuing our relationship with the Lord, understanding the things of this world are passing away. And so there's that emphasis to keep things in perspective, So sometimes people would talk to me about, well, how can I have a good marriage? And I'm saying, so why would you even want to have a good marriage? And then I try to lead them that's not really an end in itself, right? There has to be something greater than just having a good marriage. And so ultimately, it is, like we said earlier, to bring glory to God and to partner in ministry and to be Spirit-filled disciples together. I think that's the vision behind Ephesians 5. So that would be, to lift your eyes and to understand the bigger purpose, and that is something that married people and single people really share in, right?
Yes, that's good. Yeah, I mean, you make such a good point in your book that the eternal state isn't one where marriage is elevated between husband and wife, but rather that it's the bride of Christ, his people being united to him, and that's the picture, the greater picture that marriage is really pointing us to, is our union with Christ that in eternity we get to enjoy forever. And so there's a very real way in which the sign gives way to the substance, the reality in eternity. Do you, last question I have kind of in that category is just, how do you think of singleness as a, this is a place where I'm torn, because Jesus talking to the eunuch, obviously that's not a impermanent status, or Jesus talking about the eunuch rather, that's not an impermanent status, right? Someone's a eunuch, there's a singleness. Jesus is talking about, this kind of receiving. They can't go back on that. And when people think about the gift of singleness, should they think about that as a permanent status? Should they think about that as something that maybe you have for a season? Does the Bible give us enough to work with on that subject?
Yeah. So my understanding is the gift of singleness that, say, Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 7 is permanent. In other words, that, if you have a spiritual gift, right, it's not like you have it just for a season.
Yes, that's right.
The gift of hospitality or, whatever, teaching, and then, later you don't have it anymore. Of course, so we need to distinguish that from people who are currently not married, but who will one day, maybe very soon, be married. So in that case, they would not have a gift.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. That's been a one I'm wrestling with, because the way I've heard people talk about it has sometimes been, anytime you're single, you have the gift of singleness. Oh, and then you got married, you don't have the gift of singleness anymore. And I thought, man, that seems strange. It just seems like that's not the way that other spiritual gifts, as you just mentioned, seem to operate. And so I appreciate you giving your view on that. Dr. Köstenberger, it's been a joy to get to talk with you and just kind of pepper you with questions. And I feel like you've just accelerated my sermon prep process massively. You've helped significantly. So if this doesn't serve anybody in our church, it's at least served me. So thank you for the conversation. Thank you.
It was a wonderful conversation. Love to talk about marriage and family, and we'll have to talk about the Gospel of John another time.
Yes, absolutely. That's the Gospel of John is a fantastic gospel, and one I'm looking forward to digging into, and digging into your thoughts there in that biblical theology, that great work that you've done around that as well. So, Dr. Köstenberger, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Andreas Köstenberger. I know I did. I got to sit in on that, even though I wasn't on the screen, so it's good to hear from him. If you'd like to check him out more, you can go to his website, biblicalfoundations.org. You can find out more things there. There's lots of articles that they've written. Really good stuff there. Also, just a couple of books that I'd love to highlight for you from Dr. Köstenberger. He wrote one that came out in 2023 called Bibilcal Theology. I think it's called a Canonical Ethical Approach. It's pretty long, but a great book on biblical theology. He's also written books on commentaries on the Gospel of John, which we'll be going through pretty soon here as a church. So that might be something to check out. And then one that he wrote with his wife, Marnie, is God's Design for Men and Women, kind of going over exactly that, God's design for men and women. So even some of the stuff that we're talking about today. So check those books out or reach out. If you have something that this podcast really sparked for you or something you want to dialogue about, go ahead and leave a comment down below this video or this podcast. You can do that on YouTube or Spotify, and we would love to address your questions and see your comments and see what you thought about this. I hope that this helped you to understand and apply a biblical worldview to all of life, and God bless.